I'll just okay that as well. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all this evening. And my name is Lorna, for those who don't know me, and I was part of the MSc from the pandemic year 2020, and I just graduated last year in 2023. And my topic is in the area of organisational compassion. I looked at that combined with the cost of living crisis in the UK and did a qualitative study with UK employees. My contact information is on there as well, so please do connect after the session. It would be great to just keep in touch with like-minded people who are sharing mindfulness out there into the world. Let me move to my introduction and tell you a bit more about what got me into this area of research. And really, it's my career has been 20 plus years now in human resources. And I've always been really fascinated by working in different organizations and consulting with different organizations, which is what I'm doing at the moment, and seeing similar patterns of behavior unfold, whether that's when organizations are at their worst, where departments hate each other and people fall out, conflict happens at work, things end up in formal settings like grievance, like discipline, and at its best, where there's high trust, there's high performance, organizations are agile and they get things done. But whichever sort of culture the organizations have, there's similar types of repeat patterns that just seem to unfold no matter the organization, which I find really interesting. And then my journey into the MSc, I want to zoom in really on the compassion module, which is module 2 of the program. And for me, I didn't realize how much I needed this module. I had so much self-talk, that subtle inner critic that I really had to befriend, that I didn't really know that I had to. And so this module for me was probably the most transformative of the entire program. And of course, it relies on that foundation of mindfulness first, where obviously you can first of all be aware that you've got that inner critic that's maybe trying to keep you safe and stopping you from being brave and being bold and doing some other things in life. But what I loved so much about that module was the ability to relate it to my field of human resources and look at organizational compassion. How does this model of noticing, the mindfulness layer of noticing suffering and the compassion element of feeling that sense of connectedness with others and that deep empathy, but of course it's more than empathy when it comes to compassion. It's that deep wish to want to alleviate suffering in organizations as well. And Canov et al. Really talk about this in the workplace happening at a collective level when both culture and policies align to really legitimize the ability for people to notice suffering and to respond and do something about it. And then where does this crisis context come in? Well, I went deep in the compassion module to look at well, we were going through the pandemic for one, right? So that was, a crisis that was really impacting all of us globally. But what I compared that with is previous crisis responses and what was the organization's response and what's the role of compassion within that as well. And I found some really interesting research from Pangarkar, who compared the crisis responses of Toyota and Singapore Airlines, who sadly had some fatal incidents. Toyota in 2009, where they had failed to respond to safety measures. They were getting complaints about some of their Lexus models, and until a fatal crash in 2009 prompted a recall of the model, they hadn't been doing anything about it. And we're kind of seeing that play out in the press at the moment as well with Boeing. And are they putting, the safety of people at risk for the benefit of profits? And what was perhaps not very exemplary in the Toyota response, well, first of all, they knew there were some issues, but they didn't really do anything about it. They weren't really taking it seriously. And while they then ended up recalling the model and doing the right thing, because they delayed and because it was kind of forced upon them, the legitimacy of their actions was kind of in doubt. The damage had already been done to their reputation. But compare that to Singapore Airlines, and in the year 2000, there was a plane that was taking off on a runway, and there was a crash, and there was a fatal crash. And Singapore Airlines despite that real tragic loss of life, were still able to keep their reputation intact. And a big part of that was because they had some compassion elements within their response, but they also had the means with which to respond, both financially and both with emotional care. And they had grief counsellors who were flown out to Taiwan where the incident had happened. They had volunteers who were readily trained up. So they just had readiness. They had a real readiness, and they had real ownership of, it doesn't matter who was at fault for this crash. Our plane was on that runway at that time. We take full responsibility, and we're going to, we're just caring about now about the victims and their families. Of course, Singapore Airlines have had a recent incident as well, just last month or 2 months ago within Bangkok, where they had to make a diversion. There was extreme turbulence. I'm kind of close to the news to see, are they having that same level of care that they did 20 years ago, 24 years ago? To sort of see, is that still playing out now? Because again, it's huge loss, potential loss of reputation, it's loss of life, it's really, really serious stuff. But that's really, this article is more looking at the situation of what's the analysis of what an organisation has done. And I think what was missing for me, I really wanted to see if there was research about, well, what were the perspectives of the victims? What were the perspectives from the customer's point of view? And I found an article from Simpson et al. On the Brisbane floods of 2011. And this article was really interesting because they spoke with and did research with a lot of different employees from lots of different organisations. And this article really speaks to the issue of, does capitalism, or is capitalism always going to be at odds with compassion, right? Can an organization be for profit but also be compassionate? And the great thing about this article is that, yes, you can be a for-profit organization and still do the right thing by the community, by employees, etc. So what they found is that there were these organizations operating at this neoclassical capitalist side of the spectrum, where despite there being news broadcasts that the city of Brisbane had to be evacuated for this weather warning and the floods, there were organizations and employees having experiences saying, we were told, stay working, if you leave, it's on you, your pay will be docked, we can't guarantee that we can pay you, so stay working. On the other side of the spectrum, you've got this conscious capitalist organizations who were very much safety first, creating a culture of high trust, giving people flexible working options, but basically saying it's safety first, go protect your property, evacuate, and please don't worry about pay. They had just a very clear, quick message of alignment from leadership that said, do what you have to do, we'll pay you, just be safe and be well. Then we come into COVID, which obviously impacted much more globally, a lot of disruption for organisations and a big hit to well-being, but also a huge shift in workers' attitudes that then unfolded, and we started to see phenomenon like the Great Resignation come into play. And I did a pilot at that time as well, speaking with a couple of employees from different organisations to understand what was their experience like as employees, really building on that research that Simpson et al. Had done, and looking at, well, how can I maybe collect employees' accounts of their what does compassion mean to them in organizations, but coupled with a crisis, what do they expect from their employers in times of crisis? And usually it's things that were coming up like, we need transparent communication, we need to know that we're cared for, we need to know that financially we're going to be secure. And that kind of leads me on to the cost of living, which is still very much an active thing in the UK and in many other countries in the world at the moment. And what I was finding really fascinating in the literature there is the growing in-work poverty. Nurses a couple of years ago were striking. Hospitals are putting on food banks for nurses. And Waters had some interesting insights of junior doctors in England who were really struggling with household bills, and accounts of people mentioning that they were having to actually use time off, they were coming to work on holidays. And so you've got this issue happening, right, where people need to deal with these rising costs, and they also need to rest, but they're sacrificing their precious rest time to take on more shifts and to bring in more cash. And we can see that the potential knock-on impact of that is tired workers, stressed workers, exhaustion, burnout. All of these things are a real risk with that pressure of rising cost of living beyond the So I'm going to go a little bit quicker on my methodology. So I really want to get to some of the research findings and what I did. But I held 3 deep conversations looking at these 2 converging phenomena. Organizational compassion is one area. What does that mean to people? What do they count as compassion? What do they expect in terms of compassion? But coupled with this cost of living crisis, how was that impacting people? And again, what do they expect from their organization? And how were their organizations measuring up? So I spoke with 3 mid to senior level professionals, one in the public sector from, I labelled the organisation as Publico, a financial services organisation in the private sector, Finco, and a small software company also in the private sector called Techco. And the only other thing I guess I'll mention on my methodology, because you're dealing with real deep accounts of people's experience, I really wanted to do it justice for the participants and make sure that their accounts that I'd written up of them, I did a thematic analysis, I coded, I came back with about 54 codes of data, and I had a write-up that really sort of summarizes the essence of their experience. And before I submitted my dissertation, I gave each of the participants a copy of my findings chapter, redacted from the other participants' information, but that allowed them to see the story that I'd kind of built around their experience to SengeTech, both from an ethical perspective, but both just from a have I done you justice perspective, really just trying to sort of get a sense of, did I get that right? Is this what you were trying to tell me, trying to convey? Which I thought was really, really valuable, and to get their feedback and know that you kind of got it on the right page and you've done them justice is a real, I guess, relief. So let's move into the findings. In terms of compassionate support, if we think about tangible compassionate support, within each of the 3 accounts, there was either the presence or absence of these components. So communication, transparent communication, timely updates, supporting people with webinars was quite common. Emotional support for people that were maybe in hardship. Financial support, which really is split into 2 topics. There's both financial advice on things like debt management, money management, but there's also financial benefits. What's the organisation doing to actually make sure that pay is at an appropriate level, benefits and finance is at an appropriate level. Listening systems was also one that was either present or lacking. Time off to attend to important matters without, sacrifice to pay. And the way that work was organised as well, whether it was hybrid, home working, flexible working arrangements, but also how workload is being managed, because a lot of organisations were trying to do more with less, which I think has been a trend that's been going on for a number of decades now. How do we do more with less resources? I want to maybe just talk a little bit about financial and listening as 2 examples and give you some insights on maybe some of the quotes and some of the data that I was getting from the interviews. So the emotional or financial support and emotional support, actually, 2 of the organisations, Publico and Finco, both had employee assistance programmes, which were kind of these third party, your manager doesn't know, your leadership doesn't know, just accessible for all staff to go to if they needed any financial assistance, some financial support in terms of debt management, but also the emotional elements and counselling support that come with financial hardship. And that's really key, because within my findings, I was also discussing some research on just because an organisation, if we think about, the noticing part of the compassion model, just because some perhaps colleagues maybe don't know that some other colleagues are in financial hardship, doesn't mean that it's not happening. I was finding lots of research on in poverty shame. There's a great piece of research from, I think it's McBride, And what they were doing some analysis with low-paid workers and finding that there was a real, shame and pride getting in the way of people sharing with their friends that they were relying on food banks. They would just pretend that things were a lot better than they were. So the absence of noticing other people in financial hardship doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. So things like employee assistance programs are so important for that kind of discrete listening system in organizations that give people access to share and get support that they need. But also financial benefits, things like all of the employees that I spoke with said that they were receiving financial benefits, but they all expected more. Publico were in a situation of, national pay bargaining. Is the government was a real key player in determining the means with which they had to respond. But despite their financial constraints, they were still able to do things like offer employees to cash out their leave, offer to bring forward the annual pay review by 6 months. So they did try and do things that brought cash flow to people a little bit earlier. But back to what I was mentioning before, cutting people's holidays or people not being able to take time off and instead cashing it in for leave. We've got to debate, is that the right thing for people's long-term rest and well-being and recovery to actually be able to work at their best and also be well. FinCo, it's no surprise that a financial services organisation really has the means with which to respond. The employee there said that there was a £1,000 bonus given to all employees that were earning 35,000 a year or less. They had, share options, they had pension holidays, they had cash, interest-free cash loans up to 5,000 that they offered to all staff. So they really had a lot of financial benefits. And TechCo, the employee there didn't really have much by the way of financial means, but they did have a £300 bonus, sort of like their company said. It's called a keep the heating on for Christmas bonus, which again, people are really seeing the increase in household costs that particular winter of 2022 and really feeling the impact of that financially. Two of the employees had put themselves into debt, one of them to finance a holiday, the other to the utilities company to make sure that the heating was on. So the real knock-on impact for people was really quite prevalent and very much in the fore. I want to talk a bit more about the wholeness of experience, and I'm just going to maybe touch on and quickly summarise what I've just mentioned there. The impact of the cost of living crisis, coupled with the response of the organisation, was very much shaped by these enabling characteristics within the organisation that were either present or lacking, and obviously the key players involved in enabling these two. So I spoke about the government there, for example, as a key player that really detracted from the means with which Publico could give people adequate increases to weather this sharp increase in household costs. But also the employee at FinTech mentioned a family member who was out of work because they were medically unfit to work. And they were due for some government support, but because the application process for that was so cumbersome, the support never came, and they were recommended, go for appeal and you'll definitely get it. But all these hoops and the time it was taking, that employee just needed to make a call, and even though they weren't medically fit to work, just went back to work. So the impact of the government policy really, puts extra stress and strain on people to go back to work that might not quite be in a position to do so. So other key players are things like HR. The employee at TechCo mentioned that he actually fell ill, and the company policy for sick pay was 2 weeks in a year. He'd already had that. And so if he'd fallen sick just 2 weeks later, then the policy year would have reset and he would have got it. But HR, as the key player, had a hard stance of, no, we're just going to take £1,400 off your pay, to the point where the employee was like, well, how am I going to get through the month? So things like that, HR have the capacity to relax policies that are going to incur a financial penalty for people, especially at a time of a cost of living crisis. It's just very interesting to hear these things play out. The other part of this model then, so you've got the impact of the cost of living crisis, the response from the organisation within which those tangible forms of compassionate support are part of it. But none of that really means anything in terms of experience without the employee, first of all, making sense of it. And that very much is linked to their own personal circumstances. None of the people that I spoke to said that they were in massive financial hardship, but they were all impacted in some way. But what they all did, which was interesting, but just nuanced to different areas, they made comparisons with other people. And there was a real compassionate element that came through for that. Comments like, we're okay. I can't imagine the impact this is having on lower paid, lower income families, and really sort of extending that feeling, that noticing feeling, and seeing how this was maybe impacting other people. The other thing that they were doing is making comparisons with when it came to looking at the response of their organization. They were comparing that with how else has this organization responded to me before, and where else have I worked before, and what have I seen from them? So they're constantly shaped by the previous examples of compassion they've had or not from previous organizations, and obviously the expectations that they each had as employees too. So all of those elements combined really built up employees' overall experience of compassion. So they all had these elements within this model, but it was very much nuanced to how much is this crisis actually impacting me versus other people, and then what do I actually want from my organization? Do I really care about the communication, the time off, the way that they're organizing work? How does that really sort of impact me as an individual? And that was all very different. They all had very different expectations from their employers. So just moving on to the conclusion of the research. The collective model from Canov et al. Is still very much a valid model and a useful model for helping companies understand where do they have strength and where do they have weakness with compassionate policy design. And if we take an example of the person, the HR team that had sort of stuck their heels in and said, no, policy is policy. It doesn't matter if 2 weeks later you would have been paid for the sickness. We're still just going to stick to policy. That's where things like that are really misaligned with a compassionate response. And I mentioned before, that the lack of observing financial hardship in organizations, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there. There is this shame associated within work poverty. And so it's highly important that organizations have discrete listening systems, that might be pulse surveys, or it might be the employee assistance programs where it's completely external, third-party support for individuals. But if they can get a range of data and insight from people, what organizations and leadership teams can also do is communicate openly on, we're hearing this, we're hearing that employees are going through this, and normalize the discussion on these sorts of things that are typically associated with stigma or shame, and normalize discussion on these things so that people don't fall into that self-blame trap. The work of Neff very much tells us that shame is isolating and the work of compassion is about bringing back connectedness. So perhaps then there's merit in maybe some self-compassion training in organizations so that people know when they reach financial poverty, in work poverty and hardship, it's not their fault. It's a product of the circumstances with which we're in. Second conclusion is that there's definitely a limit to the means with which an organisation can respond to a financial crisis, as we can see with the likes of Publico, very much governed by what's the government doing, how does national pay bargaining come into the mix, and what's the affordability of the organisation to cope with that. So this really points to wider policy reform. And we saw about the junior doctors as well, making trade-offs, having to come in and work on their holiday time. Really what's needed here, and a lot of the medics were advocating for this in the research I did as well. A lot of them were saying that we're widening the poverty gap. We're widening the health inequality gap with this, and they need to be able to help workers pay stretch beyond the basics, beyond survival or barely surviving, and actually have enough disposable income that you can have extra activities that support your mental well-being. What else? Third one, stakeholder alignment in organizations is really key. So this very much speaks to what is our united front in times of crisis, because if you're misaligned, you're ambiguous, and it doesn't matter kind of what you do in the end. If you're not aligned from the start, then people are really not going to believe that you're truly working with compassion. And what I mentioned before about HR, relax policy rules that incur financial penalties. And the last one, just a finale, the personal circumstances and expectations of employees are in constant flux. So organisations really have a role to understand and cater for a range of needs in the interest of staff retention. That comes back to the appropriate listening systems, but also really the line manager as a key player, a key vital player, obviously supported by leadership and HR as well, to really be that first point of contact in most cases to really understand the expectations and needs of their employees. And that is all for now. Just open up to any discussion. Thank you for listening.